Hello, I'm Mark McSherry from Virtual School Victoria, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here today, and those of all the lands from which you may be viewing. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. Welcome to the second part of the Making Waves initiative for 2023 here at the Primrose Botter Salon at the Melbourne Recital Centre. These sessions are a partnership between Virtual School Victoria and the Melbourne Recital Centre and are made possible by the Victorian Department of Education's Strategic Partnership Program and the generosity of the Hugh Williamson Foundation. Today we'll be delving into how music is put together in different ways, as well as how music can be interpreted once it's there on the page. Today's guests are an ensemble known as Inventi. And Inventi are a group of musicians who specialise in curating imaginative music programming that combine new arrangements of classical music repertoire alongside new pieces that have been created often especially for them. What we'll hear today is an excellent example of that approach with a program entitled Enchanted Forest. And we'll hear a little bit more of that as we go on. So in this workshop, we'll be looking at performance interpretation, that is how performers bring a score to life, the craft of musical arrangement, the creative decisions that come into play when arranging for an ensemble such as this, and we'll have some fun, hopefully, by playing around with sounds in a creative exchange activity. I'll be taking a backseat role in this session and will hand over the main part of the whole proceedings to my two esteemed colleagues from Virtual School Victoria, Tim Dargaville and Jackie Vine. You'll meet them very shortly, but first let's hear some music. Inventi will be performing a couple of excerpts from two separate movements of a new work called Baron in the Trees by Australian composer Melody Ertbusch. And this piece was written specifically for this ensemble. After we hear it, Tim will explore further how the piece came to be. So this is Inventi with Melody Ertbusch's Baron in the Trees.
That was Baron in the Trees by Australian composer Melody Erdvosch, beautifully played by Inventi. My name's Tim Dargaville. I'd like to introduce you to the members of Inventi as we begin this next segment. And Anna McMichael on violin 1, Phoebe Maisel on violin 2, Harry Swainson on viola, Ali Partridge on cello, Gareth Hill on double bass, Melissa Dacre on flutes, and Ben Opie on oboe. Please make them all feel welcome. Let's begin with this, the concept for this program, the Enchanted Forest. Where did this idea come from and how did it come into being?
I think often with Inventi Ensemble, even if we go back to why Inventi Ensemble became an ensemble in the first place, it's basically because Melissa and I really wanted to play as much music as possible. So more often than not, a part of our programming comes from just this passion for exploring as much music as possible. So what we like to do is find a piece of music. In this case, the kernel of the program was Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. So once we started exploring that and thinking about the thematic ideas that come within Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, we started thinking, okay, well, what else could contribute to that as a program? And what we really love doing, our other passion aside from playing traditional repertoire, is commissioning new pieces of music. So then having a conversation with Melody, who has written for the ensemble, I think, maybe 5 times previously. I think we've commissioned a total of 6 works now by Melody. It seemed like a natural conversation to start having with her, particularly because a lot of Melody's music has a sort of rich storytelling and a narrative that goes through it. And so then the conversation came about, okay, if we're creating this enchanted forest, a musical enchanted forest, and you wanted to write a piece, knowing that the Beethoven was on the program, how do you feel about that? What direction do you think you could go in? And it's always interesting when we've commissioned other composers for similar sorts of things, partner pieces to different works like Holst's Planet Suite or Scheherazade. And every composer that we approach has a completely different take on how to create a partner piece. And so for Melody, it wasn't necessarily a musical connection. It wasn't even necessarily too much of a thematic connection. She didn't look at the Beethoven and how there's a storm and a folk dance. Instead, she took this idea of an enchanted forest and then found the Calvino story of Baron in the Trees, which there's the connection, the trees, which is this beautiful, quirky, strange story about a boy who defies his parents, climbs up a tree and then lives there for the rest of his life.
Yeah, it's an amazing story that's kind of set in 17th, 18th century Italy. And interesting hearing this piece by Melody, getting this sort of gloomy opening, and the opening of the story, Baron in the Trees, Cosimo, who is the young boy, is sort of sitting at the kitchen table and having an argument with his parents, and on the basis of that argument decides to climb the trees and never come down. And then the second segment of the work is being in the trees. And so the rest of the story is how Cosimo decides to live in the trees arboreally and having amazing adventures without ever touching the ground again. Really interesting to hear you explain the sort of the workings of coming up with the idea. So in a sense, you're not just performers in this situation, you're curators. There's something, it's more than just playing a piece of music or asking someone to write for you. There's this whole thing about having a creative concept. So Melissa, would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
And that goes into very much, as Ben said before, who we are and why we play together as an ensemble. And so much of music is about expressing who you are and your interests and your passions in whatever medium or output that happens to be. So for us as friends from university who, wanted to play music together, that sort of started the basis of this journey. And then to be able to work with composers who are the same age as us, who are living now, is also very exciting. You think of back in the day when the old canon of composers worked with all their colleagues. We're being able to continue that process today by working with our composer colleagues. And it's interesting to sometimes, in our case, give them a bit of not a brief, but like that kernel of inspiration, and then to see where it goes and what actually comes out of that as a piece. So, and for us to be able to, as performers, then bring that to life, that's what's fun.
So how do you work as an ensemble in terms of putting these projects together? Could you just give us a quick little picture about, is this a collaborative adventure, or is one of you a benevolent dictator? Like what happens?
Well, maybe a bit of a balance between all of those things. And also we have someone who arranges these works, Glyn Davies, a Melbourne-based arranger who, for the Beethoven and the Debussy that we'll be talking about a bit later, he's a huge part in creating these programs. But then when we do come together as an ensemble, I feel like every time we come together to perform these works, there's a slightly different way of approaching it, and it always feels very fresh. We're about to go on a tour to a few different towns in regional Victoria, and I just know that every time we perform, it's going to be a little bit different, which I think is the exciting thing about working with an ensemble like this. It's small enough so that we can be flexible to make changes like that, but large enough to create a really exciting sound and lots of textures. And within that also, I think one of our passions is making sure that works like Melodies, but also the full program, get repeat performances, and that we can keep on doing it, not just because we love it, but so that the Melodies works and these arrangements can keep having a life.
So interesting way of thinking about building repertoire from repertoire. Rather than, often I think, working as a composer in the new music scene, we often have a very clear distinction between repertoire and then there's the new music ghetto, or whatever term we might like to use. But what's really interesting about the way you're working is, well, we're building new works from this concept of being part of the repertoire, which is always where new music is sat. How fascinating to hear. Well, given that you've mentioned Debussy, Ben, maybe this is a really good time to move to our next episode, which is from that amazing piece, Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. So we're going to hear an excerpt from that.
What an absolute pleasure and an absolute treat to hear that work today. It was absolutely stunning. Today's all about, I guess, the new music as well as reimagined music, and it's just so exciting to see a combination of both. The Prelude to the Afternoon, the Faun, it was composed in 1894. And it's considered by some to be the beginning of some of the modern music as well. The composition was inspired by a poem by Stéphane Mallarmé and is a masterpiece of impressionist composition. The poem tells of the desires and dreams of a faun in the heat of the afternoon. The faun plays his panpipes, alone in the woods, and in the distance sees some dancing nymphs. He becomes interested by the passing nymphs, pursues them unsuccessfully, then wearily abandons them, and dreams the afternoon away with a sleep filled with visions. So, this leads us into our next little bit. The opening of the excerpt was just so dreamy, so romantic, so beautiful, yet we all know if you look at the music, it's complex. There are the time changes between 9/8 and 6/8 and 12/8, and they're all just so seamless, aren't they? There are so many interpretations of the work. I'd love to know how you come up with your specific interpretation, given your instrumentation and your ensemble culture.
Well, it's really interesting as we approach these arrangements, and as Ben said, we work with Glyn Davies, and we throw an idea to him and say, what about this? What about Afternoon of a Faun? And he says, but you don't have a harp. And we go down a line of sometimes the practicalities of how it turns into the arrangement. But one thing that an overarching desire that we're going for with the arrangements is not simply to show, wow, you can play a whole orchestra piece with 7 people, but to come up with a new way of listening to the piece, and perhaps something that is different to what the orchestral version is. And something that comes out in rehearsals and as we start to explore the arrangement and get it off the page is what are those things, and what bits do you sometimes hear that perhaps get lost in the general orchestral wash of a piece, that in our version you get to hear really close up, and sometimes you can hear those different lines more clearly. So it's just a different way of approaching the piece.
In regard to the performance interpretation, is there somebody that sort of determines how it's going to be, considered to be the phrasing, whether it's elongated phrasing, whether it's a vibrato usage? Is that something that's decided upon, or something that's sort of chunked out in a rehearsal situation, or does it constantly evolve and change without discussion?
A bit of both, I think. I might even hand over to Anna in just a moment to see what she thinks about this as well. But I do think in any kind of project, creative project like this, there is a bit of a combination of making some specific choices, but then also, again, I mentioned it before, this freedom that we have within an ensemble like this of only 7 people, being able to just look at someone and perhaps make a small gesture while you're playing to indicate, okay, I'm just going to take a little bit more time here, or even orally, we're all fiercely listening all the time to try and catch whether we're going to be doing something different this time. I wonder, what do you think, Anna?
I think it's a beautiful challenge that we have to realise the orchestral version but also have a chamber version. So I guess I think of the 2 versions and how to bring those together, how to turn it into a chamber work, but also thinking about that it's French Impressionist music, that it's very much about colour, texture, vibrato, so trying to sort of capture those atmospheres as well, an orchestral version. There's no harp, but what can we do to sort of give the impression of a harp as well?
And I think we all individually bring our own decision-making and our own ideas to the group, and then sometimes when there's conflicts, it's not to say one idea is better than another, they're just different, and then we'll make those decisions of, okay, well, let's try this one, or actually that one works better.
Yeah, beautiful. it all just comes together. It just looks like it's just such a natural extension of your playing, that it just comes together as an ensemble so beautifully. It really does. If you said we didn't have a harp, we couldn't use a harp, you wouldn't know it, because all the sounds are there. You know, you have that movement, it's continuous.
There's a fascinating, I suppose, thing that happens when we work on a project like this, where the Debussy, but also the Beethoven, and for previous projects as well, when we then end up going back and playing the same piece in orchestra, it feels very, very strange. Apart from anything else, for the Beethoven Symphony, all 7 of us are pretty much playing the entire time, and that rarely happens. I mean, particularly for wind players in orchestra, there's a lot of time when we're putting our instruments down, and it's just a strange and beautiful to, I think, then be able to compare as a player the 2 different versions and how we do interpret them differently.
Melissa, I'm going to ask about the that famous flute opening depicting Pan. We talk about putting the expression into the music. We sort of, as we said before, we're talking about rubato and vibrato and all that sort of thing. Do you play it the same way all the time, or do you change it each way you play?
Well, I guess the others can answer, but I think I pretty much play it differently every time. For a whole number of reasons. Sometimes it's musical choices, sometimes it's, oh, I didn't quite take a big enough breath, or I've played too loud and got into it too much at the start, so I'm having to do things along the way. So sometimes it's purely musical choices, sometimes it's just the craft of actually doing it and putting that all together.
Would you be happy to explore this a little bit further?
Sure.
Would you be able to play the first few bars just solely as it naturally happens right now, and then I might ask if we could perhaps change a couple of things as a bit of a demonstration. Just your dynamic control and tone quality, it's just gorgeous. So what would happen if we tried to perhaps change those two focal points with our elements? And what would happen if we put more vibrato in, and if we shaped the phrase out of the dynamic range of probably what it's marked a bit? Stunning, thank you. Yeah, it's just really interesting to sort of see you take one melody line and how are you going to treat it as to how it changes the whole character.
Yep.
Doesn't it really?
It's just fascinating for us then when she plays like that. That suddenly gives us a very different introduction to then. I mean, I was feeling if I was about to come in then for my note, it would be a very different quality of sound because of the way it's been set up.
Is that possible to do you think? Could we perhaps have a little listen to that, just that short section?
Yeah, sure.
It really does just change the whole character, doesn't it? It's gorgeous. Thank you so much for doing that. I guess the other element that really features right throughout that specific opening of the work was the level of rhythmic complexity. I guess it'd be great to sort of hear just perhaps if we just took one one chunk of the ensemble section from maybe 21 to 31, if we can probably hear that, there's this whole ensemble technique that's going on, because we don't have a conductor out the front. We don't have anyone dictating time. We have these rubato sections, which is just, this pulling of an elastic band of time. It's just constantly changing. Yet the pulse is quite sort of hidden in the background too. It's not a heavily pulsed work. So as an ensemble, how do you put all of that together? Because it's so complex, but still it's in time. So I wonder if you can kind of talk us through that, and then perhaps we might work with that section too.
Yeah, I might throw to Ali in just a moment about this one, particularly because of this section and maybe the one coming up around bar 27. I think that it's a bit about gesture. I feel like that's what helps us when there's not a conductor and there's not necessarily just a chugging pulse that's going on somewhere. It ends up being we are all giving these very subtle physical movements and physical gestures along the way that I think help us. But I would say, for me, it's about the gesture that each of us are showing along the way that helps us stay together. What do you think, Ali?
I think Benny summed it up really well. As we were playing before, you probably noticed that there were a lot of movement, a lot of eye contact, and we're hearing and we're seeing and we're feeling. We're trying to go on the journey together. And I think with this impressionist music, we've got to kind of move along together, and that really helps the flow and the rhythmic pulse, and internally as well, feeling that and showing it to others. And we can latch on to that.
And knowing what everyone else is doing as well. Like, I feel in this section, right at bar 21 there, I have to look at Gareth, because he's got a pits and we've got to place that together. And then the next bar, the other strings are going, and it's, I know that I have to wait for a pits there. So I'm kind of following that and listening, and there's the pits, and then that goes on, So you kind of know how the whole puzzle fits together. And that then if people do take a bit of time here or there, you've still got those oral benchmarks, and there's the physicality to show.
Fantastic. I'm wondering if we could possibly have a look at that. Could we have a look at perhaps from bar 21 to 31, if that's a good spot, and sort of observe those physical expressions that come with it? That would be lovely. Lovely. It's really obvious, isn't it, when you can actually see and hear at the same time. That's the thing we sort of miss from recordings. We just don't get that physical connectedness that we see in musicians and ensemble works. So I'm just wondering, what would happen if we were to remove that physical component? Would that work? Is that something we could also experiment with, perhaps?
Absolutely, yep.
So how hard will it be to, since you've been rehearsing, working, moving together, how hard is it going to be to actually just focus on what's in front rather than what's happening around you, I wonder?
So not look at each other.
Yeah, I think it's also what Melissa's saying, that we have to understand the score, and if we understand the score and listen, then theoretically we should be able to play it.
But let's give it a go. So,
all right, are we up for the challenge?
Yeah. This is with as little looking at each other and as little physical movement as possible.
Well done.
I think it deserves a round of applause. Absolutely. It's interesting, the opening to me felt a little bit like the blind leading the blind. But after a while, there was a sense of, it does feel like there is a coming together that sort of happens naturally, even if you're not deliberately aiming for that to happen.
It's interesting though, I'm not sure how the others felt about it, but I do feel like when we're able to connect with each other more, our gestures become larger and maybe a little bit more exaggerated. I was feeling like some of the crescendos that we had perhaps weren't as big because we weren't helping each other to make them as big through those small physical gestures that we do.
It felt very odd to not move. I was finding I was having to hold myself still because the natural gesture of wanting to move with what you're playing is, for me, always there.
Yeah, the musicality of physical movement really affects how you play, I think.
It's funny, the natural cause of breath, when you're phrasing, obviously you're breathing together, even though you're not playing brass instruments, you're playing woodwind instruments or string instruments, but you've still got that natural source of breathing together, moving together, and as soon as you take that away and that eye contact makes it so much more challenging, that the music sort of, it suffers, doesn't it, a little bit? You know, you're all brilliant musicians. That was just...
I wonder if that's also something to do with the nature of this particular piece, where there is such a natural sense of different kinds of pulsations, and the fact that it was originally music for a ballet. Motion is such a significant part. What I find is really interesting is these sort of overlapping sort of feelings of motion between different players in the group. When we were putting this workshop together, Jackie and I kind of locked into the same excerpt from this piece for different reasons, and we thought actually it would be a really fun thing to try, looking at the same music but from two different perspectives. So having looked at sort of the performance angle of what it takes to play that particular passage, I thought it might also be good to look at the same passage but from an arrangement perspective, looking at how you work with what is a beautiful orchestral work and what translates into this context. So I had a general question just about when you're making decisions about taking something from an orchestral situation for this situation, how do you make decisions? What kind of decisions do you make?
Sometimes there's a playfulness element to it. So I'm not particularly thinking about this one right now, but in Scheherazade there's a very famous bassoon solo, which probably, if we wanted to, it would make sense to put it on the cor anglais when we don't have a bassoon in the mix. But we gave it to the alto flute instead. And again, it's that idea of sometimes it's just fascinating to hear a solo like that on an instrument that it wasn't necessarily meant for. So that's one part of the decision-making process. Some of the other ones can be, so for example, with this harp passage that we've been talking about, it's not that we necessarily or almost ever want to emulate what's going on in the orchestral version. Rather, what was the gesture around that particular musical moment, and how can we contribute to that?
Right. So you are sort of taking some creative liberties, aren't you?
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll come to that notorious harp passage in a moment. But given that you're talking about, a significant way of getting started with an arrangement is looking at what are the instruments that are available to us and what might be used. I thought it might be nice to sort of play around with, seeing as you've brought your lovely cor anglais, Ben, what might that passage sound like, bars 21 to 31, played on the cor with strings? So
well, we might actually do the one after that, the bars 31.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yep.
Happy to stand corrected. Sir.
All good.
That's great. Just sure,
Yeah. And it's direct. Big figure.
Thank you for that. It's amazing the difference that it makes. Would you like to just try that lower passage again, just so that we can just hear you?
And so, just for clarity, so this is bar 34, and usually, the way that it would sound on the oboe, but we're going to take it down the octave. Which is out of the range of the oboe, which is the other enjoyable thing that we can do with some of the auxiliary instruments.
Yeah, so and I'm interested to ask other players in the group, trying that on the cor anglais, how does that make you feel about what you're doing to accompany what Ben does? Does that change your thinking about what you might do, the fact that the sound feels much lower and more resonant?
For us, not so much. We're busy being a harp here. Getting our pizzicatos.
I think for me it follows on to I echo each time, so the and then I play it on the flute. And when Ben played it down and my echo was still up, that felt a bit jarring to me.
Oh, right.
So,
there's a little bit more of an abyss to stare into.
Yeah, so it's just how it fits in the broader section then is a question.
Because there's such a lot of continuity of line throughout the instruments, isn't it? So that thing about keeping a line together, or if it breaks, how much can we afford to break it before it becomes too fragmented? Thank you for trying that. How interesting. Well, let's go to this notorious harp passage. I thought it would be really interesting to hear the opening of the original orchestral version and then get a sense of what's happening over here between two violins. So if we could go with audio excerpt 1, this is the opening of the orchestral version of the prelude. So let's go to that opening passage as a group to begin with, and perhaps focus on Phoebe's part, because you've got something that, when I saw it, I was quite shocked by this, because this in no way is what Phoebe playing at this point actually in the original score. All right, it doesn't exist, but it's such a stunning effect. So let's hear the same passage, and interesting to hear the flute line paced very differently again, isn't it? So let's hear that same passage, which is bars 1 to, I think it's bar 10, and compare the differences and focus on the harp texture and how that's transformed. Thank you. And while we're in the same space, let's go to audio excerpt 2, which is the next passage along where both violins here kind of do a mashup of the harp part and something quite different again. So let's hear the original for excerpt 2. So we can hear the harp very faintly in there. So could we just hear you, Anna and Phoebe, just play that passage together, just to hear how that effect's been transformed?
I think we're trying to capture the vagueness of it as well, a sort of very, very floaty, vague sound. That's our intention anyway.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So the harp original is kind of, it's a one flourish. That's like a line that comes up and down, whereas you two are sort of overlapping and doing this really interesting active kind of texture. So what was the arranger thinking? What was Glyn thinking here? Can you explain how these sort of decisions came about?
Yeah, well, I think, again, it's going to the essence of what Debussy was going for, which is, it's like in the very opening, the horn comes in and there's that rippling effect, and then it leads towards the bass that finally arrives. So it's filling in that rippling effect or that extra shimmer that's on the top. And I think if you threw it out to a whole class of composers and said, write a shimmering effect, you'd get all sorts. So it's just Debussy's gone for that particular effect, but it's not to say that it can't be achieved with something else. So, yeah, in this case, that's again a discussion that we have with Glyn and say, how does it work? We decided not to put it in the double bass, but to stick with the violins, so those decisions come into play.
So these decisions are kind of made sort of in the moment, but with some kind of understanding of an overall sort of vision. Would that be right?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting then, because in a way what I'm hearing you say is quite radical, which is to say, well, the score is not the letter of the law here. We're actually adapting to suit our particular situations and circumstances. Would that be a fair sort of observation?
Like I said earlier, it's just to go for the overall essence of a piece, and we're not going to have the 60 players or the 25 different instruments to use. So how can we still convey that general essence of a piece through what we have? So, yeah, there's always different decisions that then get made.
Yeah. So do you think about emulating the sound of a full orchestra, or are you looking for something different?
At times,
sometimes,
definitely, yeah. And we might hear it in the Beethoven a little bit later, where when the thrill, I think, of being in an ensemble like this, of a 7-piece, how big can we sound? That's one of the challenges for only 7 players, but also 7 people is enough. Like we've got enough power in the bass and in the texture that we can create. So although it's not always the case that we're looking to really sound like an orchestra, when we do want to, it's fun to get as close as we possibly can.
Right. Well, let's try that right now. So I'm going to jump to bars 42 to 48. And if we can hear the original orchestral version, so this is excerpt number 3. So interesting to hear in that there is a continuous kind of line, but lots of swapping of instruments going on in the original. Let's hear what happens to the same passage in your version. Thank you for that. How would you describe some of the differences between your version and the original?
Again, I think we're going for that general build up to that big section in the middle. Occasionally, sometimes we need to make little adjustments. So there's a lovely cello line which is in bar 45, I think. And when you translate the original orchestral dynamics to our group, we found it was just obliterating the cello. And so that's, again, just kind of putting a dampener on the rest of the ensemble so that Ali can come through in that bit there. That's just one example, but sometimes we do make decisions like that just because of the nature of one player per part, that changes things.
And interesting to hear cello featured at this point in quite a striking kind of way. It's a very strong solo presence in the way that there's not something like that in the original version. I think we should just close out this little segment by hearing the end of this beautiful piece, Afternoon, performed by Claude Debussy. So we'll hear the last 10 bars or so. So we turn now to the third work in your program, which is Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, which sounds like an extraordinary undertaking to take with such a small ensemble. Tell us about why this was such an important work in terms of the creative concept when we started with The Enchanted Forest, because you mentioned earlier that this was the go-to piece.
I think Melissa and I never shy away from a challenge. That's probably one of the driving forces behind the programming that we choose sometimes. But really, the music itself is so vivid. And I think it was one of those pieces that, for me personally, it stuck with me from childhood. I think the way that Beethoven takes us on this beautiful journey and that it is so I mean, he says that the music's not programmatic, but we can hear it in the music. There's this beautiful folk dance, there's the storm that comes in the lower instruments, and the resolution at the end that is just so beautiful. It's just such rich music. And I think, again, this idea of trying to translate it to an ensemble of 7 people, it was almost too appealing to not give it a go and see what kind of things we could create out of it. I think also with our approach to anything like this and future projects and past projects is that whatever direction we go in with it as this arrangement, we're going to find something. And I think that's what we've noticed over the previous projects that we've done and the ones that are coming up, is that it's never wrong. It always evolves somehow. And so when we get the music to start with, sure, it'll take a little bit of time and rehearsing to see what direction we need to take it in, but it's always there. I think that's the beauty of Inventi Ensemble, is that there's an openness to making it work. And I think that was, again, choosing the Beethoven because of the music first. That was the reason, I suppose. And then making it work with the creative choices that we make along the way.
And also, as Ben said, the storytelling part of it, that's a big part of how we put together our programs. And it's a great way to bring the audience along on the journey of whatever piece that we're playing. So it's not simply like, here's some music, but here's behind the piece, so that you activate people's imaginations, whether it's the Baron in the trees and what that is, or the programmatic parts of this piece.
So tell us about the outline of the Pastoral Symphony, because there's 5 movements and each has a particular title, doesn't it?
So Beethoven loved being out in the country. He lived in Vienna, but then he spent a lot of time out in the countryside, and that's his inspiration for this piece. So it starts with, the first movement is a lovely day out in the country, setting the scene. The second movement is a scene by a brook or a stream. There's lots of running semiquavers and things that build that one. The third one is...
In the village?
In the village.
The folk dance.
So there's folk dances, there's... very much a country village feeling. And interestingly, the third, fourth and fifth movements all segue together. So the third gets cut short in the middle of the music with the storm, the arrival of the storm. So that's the fourth movement. And then the fifth one is the calm after the storm and being thankful that life is okay.
Right. And interesting because we do think of this piece as programmatic, but as you point out, Ben, Beethoven didn't think so. In fact, he sort of described it more as an expression of feeling rather than story. It's also worth probably remembering that at this time that the piece was written, 1808, Beethoven was grappling with his own hearing loss. And we know that, through the Heiligenstadt Testament, this suicide note that he wrote. This is a guy who's had a very, very difficult period. And so in some respects, you also wonder about this connection to nature and its restorative aspect and how important that clearly was to him. Anna, I'd like to go to you just briefly and ask about, in Beethoven's time, what kind of orchestra was he writing for? Because I know this is something that's very much part of your professional practice.
Well, he would have been writing just like most composers write for the instruments that they know and the sound colours that they know those instruments can make. So the instruments of the time, reasonably similar but more wooden flutes, oboes more wooden, gut strings made out of sheep's gut or lamb's gut, so different sound colours. Cello would not have a spike, so would be... I guess a slightly different style of playing and gesture as well. Bows slightly different, a little bit more even sound, a little bit more upper half playing. So definitely a slightly different approach. So I think it's good to be aware of these things when you're playing this music, because the composers are really writing with specific things in mind. So,
and there's a lot of research going back now, a couple of 100 years, looking at playing techniques and instrument design, and all of this is quite quite a big scene in and of itself, which I know you're certainly part of. What do you think was in Beethoven's mind when he wrote the theme for the fifth movement, which is where we're taking as our point of departure? Any sort of suggestion or guesswork there?
Well, it's quite a vocal theme, so but also, like you say, very peaceful and very restorative. So I guess I think of it like that. When you reach this moment, it's really sort of blissful outdoors, beautiful countryside, very peaceful nature. I think it's really interesting also that we're doing this small version, because at the time people didn't have TV, they didn't have, films, and to hear live music you would go to a concert, but then to actually recreate it you'd have to do that in your own home.
Something like this.
So there's a tradition of doing arrangements and having a go at the symphony, which is what we're doing.
Rather than watch Netflix or... Yeah. Well, would you mind just if you're playing the theme in its kind of pristine version, just on a violin solo?
Try and be pristine.
Okay. There's a beautiful simplicity to it. Beethoven, we know, was a continuous and obsessive sketcher. So his working process was to continually work and refine and change and throw out and redo. And we certainly know from the existence of the sketchbooks that are still you can see he would spend a long time looking for the perfect opening upbeat for a particular phrase. So this is someone for whom creating does not come easily, and it wasn't kind of like the Mozartian ideal of, I can just write 30 minutes of orchestral music in 1 hour, let's just do that. For Beethoven, it was a very dedicated struggle. And I thought it would be, in moving into hearing the excerpt from the Pastoral in a moment, it might be interesting to play around with some ideas about what he might have been thinking in terms of the setting of this theme, which we've just heard. So this theme kind of forms the core of the fifth movement. It's a very standout melodic idea, and I guess thinking arrangement-wise, some of the things crop up are what kind of things could we do with this? How could we set it? So I'm going to throw to you, Ben. I'd like you to put the Ludwig van Beethoven cap on, and I'd like you to say, all right, let's try it like this and see what happens.
Well, I'd be curious. So we've just had the storm. That's where we're coming from with this. I wonder if we play this in a way this time where, rather than the storm having drifted away, because we haven't even heard that in the version that we're doing right now, the storm is perhaps still going. So can we create a mood of this theme that is actually still quite stormy? That could even include some techniques in the cello that maybe get us some rumbling of thunder still going. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a dynamic change. I feel like the Inventi team are adaptable enough to maybe just give this a go without too much specific instruction around technique. So we're not necessarily going to be changing the actual parts this time, unless you want to. But more we're going to be going for this idea that the storm hasn't finished yet.
Right.
So this is bar 9.
It's a very nice storm. Can I make a suggestion here? If we want to dirty it up a little bit, can we change it? We're in F major. Can we change to F natural minor? So if you're an E, you're an E flat. If you're a D, you're a D flat. Can we try exactly like that with those beautiful articulations? But let's see what happens if we make it a little more chromatic. Yes? All of a sudden I feel like I've walked into, sort of like Exodus or something like that. Interesting to think about this whole thing about when there's an idea, how we might play around with setting it. So let's kind of go to the theme and let's call out for suggestions, and feel free to join in with ideas here about how we might take that opening theme and place it in the ensemble. Do you want to start the ball rolling there, Melissa?
Yeah, well, I reckon let's put it in the bass and the cello and let's put the accompaniment.
Okay, so we're still doing bars 9 to 16, but we're sort of flipping the role.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay?
Yeah.
Cool. very mighty down there. So another suggestion, another kind of combination. So we're not really changing the material, we're just thinking about where to place it in terms of its register. So much about what register is in music is, in some respects, it's to do with colour and character and personality. So another suggestion for a different combination.
What if we keep that, but put pizzicato in these strings?
Can we go pits here too then?
Yeah, great. Pits everyone and no winds.
No winds. Okay, cool. Okay, interesting. Again, this whole thing about character, it just feels so different. Can I make a suggestion? I'd like to sort of play around with breaking up the theme into little segments. So if we keep the original backing from bars 9 to 16, but perhaps if we swap between you, Melissa and Ben. So maybe, Melissa, if you take the first 2 bars, Ben the next 2, maybe if you pick it up on the upbeat with the next one. So we have the thread happening, but its colour is changing. We get a bit more of a conversation between you two. Can we go the coloristic version now and go corongle and piccolo? Can we try that? Let's break the line. Keep feeding us with more. How often do you get to play with an ensemble of fantastic musicians? Come on, put on that Beethoven hat and let's see how we go. So let's try the same thing again, but with greater difference between the 2 lead parts. Sorry, I sprung that on you, didn't I? I'm sorry about that. So isn't it fascinating to kind of get a sense of how register and colour make this enormous impact on the way we can feel material and combinations of things?
One thing that I did want to mention, so that just the previous time that we did that before I picked up the core, and this is something that we have to do in Inventi Ensemble a lot, I still played my original part before then taking over the melody part. Because there's so much going on and so much texture that we need to keep in there, we are constantly having to have our second clarinet hat on and then quickly change to principal horn and then jump straight back into second clarinet again.
So do you ever hyperventilate and run out of breath? Because it sounds like with those kind of flipping roles between
I think it's less about breath, less about the physicality and more about the brain part of it, just knowing what role I'm playing at any given point in time.
And do you find this is also the case for the ensemble in general, this thing about we have to keep the musical narrative going no matter what, and so we might need to move between here and there in a way that you don't in the original? Yes, very much so. Another go at a different combination again? Any other thoughts?
I think it was in the...
Just hang on a second, we'll give you a mic.
Before, when you were playing the Debussy, there was like a tiny section where flute and cello were playing something together, and I wrote it down. I was like, that sounds cool. Can the both of you have the melody somehow? I don't know if you want to like split octaves, like that. Make it blend nicely. Yeah.
Do you want to hear it with backing or just the melody?
With backing.
With backing.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add to that or change?
Could we try swapping so like the flute is below and the cello is above?
Well, I
is
think
that possible?
I think what happened then was we were actually naturally, I think, in our comfortable octaves, and we were actually, I think, 2 octaves apart.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Ali, can we meet in the middle? Like
so it's
you
a bit
put
more
up
blended.
an octave and I put down an octave.
Yes. Perfect.
Then I think we'll be in the same place.
Wow, wow, wow. Isn't that beautiful? And this becomes endless, really, doesn't it? You can sort of feel that. Thank you for those suggestions.
And that's one thing, though, in Inventi, we're up for doing that, is finding what those different sounds are. And, I mean, that would be fairly uncomfortable for the cello, perhaps, to be that high. For the flute, it's right at the bottom of the range. But you get such an interesting sound.
Yes. Yeah. So let's go to what Beethoven actually decided to do. So we've got 3 treatments of the melody from the original setting, and in your arrangement, it's actually the settings are really quite close to the original, which is really interesting. So let's hear so bars 9 to 10, followed by the second treatment, and then followed by the third treatment. So excerpt 10, 11, and 12. So if we could go excerpt 10, so bars 9 and 10. And for those of you listening at home, you've got those excerpts in front of you there. You can see there's a continuous line in the violin and sustained tones and a gentle kind of rhythmic pulsation. Let's go to the next treatment, which is bars 17 to 24. And here, interestingly, what Beethoven does is he doesn't really change the theme too much other than to place it in a different register, but it's the backing that changes and we find more rhythmic activity. So let's hear this next treatment. Okay, there we go, a lovely swell at the end there. Listen to those semiquavers there that violin 1 introduces, because this becomes, again, in the third treatment, something gets built on again. So again, we move the theme into a different register, we get triplet quavers and a much stronger dynamic, and this is the effect. So we're now going to bars 25 to 32. And in the original piece, what Beethoven does is he puts these 3 treatments together at the beginning of the movement, and this is what many scholars now call the Beethoven wedge. So basically, each treatment adds to the previous, the register is much broader, dynamics grow and so on. So let's hear all 3 together. So we're doing bars 9 to 32. Thank you for that. Wonderful to hear that sort of display of change in feel and mood owing to register and colour. We're going to listen now to the end of the 5th movement of the Pastoral, which is this incredible display of what happens to this theme in all sorts of treatments. You'll hear different motives from that theme played out throughout the ensemble. It's an incredibly dynamic and dramatic finish, and Inventi play it so wonderfully. So let's hear the end of the 5th movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral.
the Inventi Ensemble, Beethoven. And can I just say that I've been sitting in the background here, and what you have talked about today and what I've heard today has been remarkable. And I think everybody who perhaps is not into repertoire, into classical repertoire, should all be here today and listening to what you're saying, because there is such subtlety and such gems coming from you. And I just personally want to thank you for that. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I'm just wondering if there are any questions from the audience to these remarkable musicians. No. Yeah, I've got about 15, but there you go. And may I say, look, it was lovely to hear the prelude of the Afternoon of the Faun, the Debussy piece, because it took me back specifically to being a 13, 14-year-old. I'm not an orchestral player, but I was studying music, and I'd sort of, music appreciation stuff, and I was getting into the analysis of Beethoven, and started with Bach and Mozart, Beethoven. And the first time I heard that Debussy piece, it was like this revelation that there was this music in the traditional Western canon that just opened me into some new, beautiful tone colours, just great ideas. And it was just lovely to be back there hearing it again, almost for the first time in a completely new ensemble. Thank you again. I have been tasked with wrapping up proceedings here. So first off, can we take a moment just again to thank these performers, the Inventi Ensemble, Anna, Phoebe, Harry, Ali, Gareth, Melissa and Ben. And take a little break, but can we also acknowledge the insight and the brilliant work of our facilitators today from VSV, Jackie Vine and Dr. Tim Dargaville. And as always, thanks to Fiona Webster and the executive team at Virtual School Victoria, the Victorian Department of Education and the Hugh Williamson Foundation, and everyone here at the MRC today, Vic, Andy, Simon, Lloyd, John, from Firestream for all the video side of things, Alex, Eamon and Vex, and of course Belinda Ash, without whom none of this would actually happen. Thank you again from everyone. Thank you to musicians and everyone involved. My name is Mark McSherry. See you at the next one.